Hello everyone, I'm bringing you a bonus mannequin video today, and this sometimes happens where the poll over on Patreon, which we choose the topic that's going to be covered in Mannequin for the month each month, ends up having two topics with the same number of votes, and so I tend to cover one of those topics as Mannequin for the month and then make a bonus mannequin video, and that's what's happened this month. So obviously one of the topics was covered in Mannequin for the month, and we're moving on to look at the second topic now, and that is the kit of a private in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. I always stumble over the beginning of that. Serving in Korea in 1951, specifically focusing on the Battle of Kapyong, which is quite interesting. The kit and so forth we have here is, much of it is a holdover from the Second World War, of course, as we'll see as we talk about this in more detail. The uniform is also a slightly modified version of Canadian battle dress, and again we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in just a minute or two. Briefly going over the Battle of Kapyong, it was a defensive action fought against the Chinese offensive towards the end of April 1951. And primarily involved Canadian, Australian and New Zealand troops. So quite interesting from that point of view, involving Commonwealth troops, and certainly of interest to me from that point of view. And as I say, it's part of that early period of the Korean War, where there was still some movement, obviously the Chinese offensive pushing back the United Nations forces and so forth before the more static period of the war had really set in. And quite interesting from that point of view, and there's a huge amount of information out there available online, well worth going and having a read and getting a head round sort of the events of the battle. It is quite interesting, and as I say, interesting because it involves Australia, New Zealand and Canadian troops fighting together. The kit we have here, as already mentioned, sort of a holdover from the Second World War, which was true of many armies fighting in Korea at the time. The web equipment is 1937 pattern, the uniform is battle dress, and what we have here in particular is kit set up to represent soldiers moving into the line preparatory to the Battle of Kapyong, and this is based on photographs showing sort of the extra kit that was carried at the time. So we have bandoliers of ammunition, we have the ground sheet up on top of the pack here. Photographs also show some men carrying shovels, carrying boxes which I believe are actually rations, and various other bits of kit as moving into the line, and obviously having disembarked from motor transport and actually then having to carry the extra kit with them as they deployed. So we'll talk a little bit more about that again as we move the mannequin round. Talking about this all in more detail, we'll start at the top as we normally do. And we have here a drab wool beret, the brown leather sweatband, as you can see here, bearing the cap badge of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, bimetal cap badge in this instance, the cipher in the centre there being in a silver metal. And the drab wool beret, again, a holdover from the Second World War. It had been introduced towards the end of the Second World War and became quite common with British and Commonwealth troops. So you see in Korea, some British troops, when initially deployed, were still wearing the drab wool beret with the brown leather sweatband, just as we have here. Obviously, the midnight blue beret was beginning to, had been replacing it since 1948 when it was introduced, and there was sort of a few of these still knocking around, but the midnight blue beret was rapidly becoming the standard. New Zealand troops were still wearing the drab wool beret when they deployed, and of course Canadian troops were as well. So it was something of it'd been introduced at the end of the Second World War and was still being worn by many Commonwealth troops who were deployed to Korea. The battle dress uniform we have here is we have the wool shirt underneath the blouse. That's quite interesting, the Canadian wool shirt worn with the battle dress. We can't look at many of the details of this here, but I'll probably make a video going forward looking at this in more detail because it has a few interesting features to it, not least you can actually button the collar down. There are buttons here and here which allow the collar to be buttoned down, and some other features which are interesting as well, and we'll have a look at that in a future video devoid of the rest of the uniform and the equipment, so we can actually have a look at those details. But that's probably going to come out in the next few weeks, so I'll make a video talking about that. The Canadian wool shirt there and the battle dress blouse over the top. See, we can't look at the rest of the battle dress uniform here on this mannequin. We have the battle dress trousers and ankle boots and so forth as well. Maybe make a video going forward with me wearing all the kit to show off that side of it as well at some point in the future. We have the battle dress blouse here, made to sometimes referred to as the Canadian 1949 pattern. I believe this was introduced in 1949, and it's a modification of the wartime battle dress in that it's designed primarily to have the collar worn open as we have here, change design to the lapels and so forth. It's equivalent to the British 1947 pattern in the design of the lapels. You don't have the notch of the British 1949 pattern. Canada stuck with this type of lapel for their post-war battle dress uniform, and quite smart, but it does have the disadvantage of not being designed to button up to the collar, although you can. There is a button under here and a buttonhole there, so you can button the collar up if required, but worn open here, as you can see. I've already mentioned the web equipment used is 1937 pattern, and this is primarily of Canadian manufacture. The components we have here, so we have Canadian ammunition pouches there, basic pouches, obviously designed for carrying Bren gun, magazines, and also rifle ammunition in bandoliers and grenades. So sort of universal from that point of view. And of course, Canada's still using the rifle number 4, obviously using 303 ammunition and still using the Bren gun as well, of course. So ideal from that point of view, ideal equipment for carrying the ammunition for those weapons. You have the straps coming around here, the shoulder straps, the L straps from the pack in this instance, which is carried on the back, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And these are of a distinctive Canadian pattern where the 2-inch section comes all the way down to the hooks here, which hook into the top of the ammunition pouches, which you can see there. And as I say, Canadian web equipment, unblancoed in this instance. There is quite a bit of colour footage of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry operating in Korea, and they tend to show that blanco was not used. The webbing does appear to be bare, or at least in this finish, so they were using a khaki blanco, if anything, but it does appear the equipment was unblancoed. That's what kind of can glean from the footage of the time, so that's what we have here. In addition to the ammunition carried in the basic pouches around the front here, there are 2 bandoliers, and this is very common to see in photographs, the men carrying extra ammunition. Each of these bandoliers holds 50 rounds, so you have an extra 100 rounds there, which is not to be sniffed at. Carried in charges in here, so each of these pockets contains 2 charges of 5 rounds each, 303 ammunition, which could be used in the rifle or could be reloaded into Bren gun magazines, of course, for use in the Bren. So quite a bit of extra sustained firepower there, and having this extra 100 rounds of ammunition. The photos I've seen, the majority of men are carrying these, so each man had an extra 100 rounds with them in bandoliers, and that's what we have here. Makes sense if moving into positions which you're intending to defend for a prolonged period, obviously, to take as much ammunition with you as you can. So we have the extra ammunition carried in bandoliers there. Moving this round to look at the right-hand side, we can see the insignia on the arm of the battle dress here, and right up in the top, the shoulder seam here, we have the PPCLI shoulder title. That's Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, of course. And beneath that, we have the badge of the Canadian 25th Infantry Brigade. Now, the brigade, the PPCLI was part of the brigade, but had actually been deployed forward initially to Japan and then to Korea. The rest of the brigade would follow up later on, but we do have that there, the badge of the Canadian 25th Infantry Brigade. Later on, this badge would become sort of synonymous with Canadian deployments overseas as a sort of national badge, but at the time it did represent the brigade. Obviously that's one just below the shoulder title there on the arm. Something I always mention with battle dress is the slight forward curve of the arm here, which is of course intended as part of the design to make it easier to bring a rifle up to the shoulder. It basically makes that movement that little bit easier, shaped to follow that curve of the arm. And concealed buttons on this, so we have the cuff there with a concealed button, single button, otherwise an open cuff there, no gusset or anything, of course. I can't show you any of the buttons on this because they are all concealed, and the ones up on the epaulets are hidden, but they are Canadian battle dress buttons, which are pressed metal with a metal pin through the centre, which the thread wraps around, sort of progenitor of the slotted buttons that we used later on. I have actually made a video talking about those specifically on the channel, quite a niche topic, but it is there if anyone wants to go and have a look at that. And then round on the back, you can see the side profile of the pack there, and we have the ground sheet rolled up on top of that, sort of loosely rolled up and just shoved underneath the supporting straps. If we lift the arm out of the way here, we can see we have the water bottle carried round on the hip here, and this is the enamel felt covered water bottle, which had been in use since, designed similar to this, had been in use since prior to the Great War, of course, so quite long in the tooth by this point, and better designs were around, but still in use with British and other Commonwealth troops at the time as well, in a Canadian carrier, marked out by the fact that the snap or press stud is round on the front of the carrier rather than up on the shoulder of the bottle there, as you can see. So water bottle carried round on the hip there on the brace ends, so where the braces come down to support the belt by buckling onto the pouches, the ends then come down and you buckle the carrier onto the ends of those to carry it round on the hip there, as you can see. Looking at the back of the Mannequin here, you can see that ground sheet really has been very loosely rolled up and sort of just shoved underneath the straps, and I say this is replicated off photographs used for reference for this video. The pack is heavily loaded, as you can see here, and carried in preference to the haversack because it gives you that little bit extra carrying capacity. In terms of volume, it's one big open space without the dividers inside, and it does give a much greater carrying capacity than the haversack. So the pack is carried in place of that on the back, as you can see. No entrenching tool or anything carried around the back here. In some instances, men were carrying shovels in the photograph I used to reference this, but not everyone had them, so I've omitted it from this Mannequin, but I will mention that here. They were carrying GS shovels with them at the time, in the photograph, some of them. So the lack of the entrenching tool makes sense from that point of view. Other digging implements were available. So the pack carried on the back there in place of the haversack, and obviously the ground sheet rolled up, carried underneath the supporting straps on the top here, as you can see there. Moving around to look at the left-hand side of this, you can see here we have the insignia again on the arm, the shoulder title up at the top of the shoulder seam there, and beneath it the brigade insignia. Of course, later the Commonwealth Division insignia would replace the brigade insignia. On one arm, you'd have a division on one and brigade on the other, when obviously on the formation and the availability of insignia for the British Commonwealth Division. Forward sweep of the arm, as we've talked about previously. I lift the arm out of the way here. You can see the bayonet carried round on the hip in the frog here. This is the spike bayonet for the No. 4 rifle, carried in a Second War bayonet frog, or a design derived from the Second War bayonet frog. This frog had initially been designed for use with the sword bayonet, sword bayonet used with the rifle No. 1 Mark III Star, and obviously that centre loop there is intended for use with that scabbard of that bayonet. The top loop has been modified with a buttonhole to take the smaller stud set higher up on the scabbard of the spike bayonet, as you can see here. So pretty standard stuff, again, just carried across from the Second World War, basically standard Second World War kit, still in use in the early 1950s. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. I certainly find the Commonwealth involvement in the Korean War very interesting, particularly the period before the formation of the Commonwealth Division. This is part of that story leading up to that. And obviously the deployment of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry as the first Canadian unit, the battalion, deployed to Korea. And obviously they'd initially arrived in Japan, and then as the situation changed in Korea and the Chinese got involved, they were rapidly moved to Korea to bolster the defence. And that's interesting in and of itself. And obviously the Canadian involvement would expand from there, which is a story all of itself. And that's something I've covered a little bit in previous videos, looking at kit and so forth on the Mannequin. Talked a little bit more about Canada's later involvement in the Korean War as well. So I do hope you found this interesting. As I say, it's all part of that story, and there's a huge amount of information online, of course, available. And if you're interested in Commonwealth involvement in the Korean War, I highly recommend going and just Googling and having a look at the various resources which are out there. It's very interesting. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you'd like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I said before, Patreon gives you the opportunity to vote each month on what's going to be covered in Mannequin for the month. And if there are 2 topics that come in with the same number of votes, you end up with a bonus Mannequin video as well. So go and check that out if you're interested in being involved in picking the topic that's going to be covered each month. And as I always say, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel, both on Patreon and PayPal. Really, it is greatly appreciated, as I always say. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And there will of course be photographs of this posted up over there as well if you'd like a closer look. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.